But we're going to go ahead and get started here with Josh for Liberty, our speaker tonight. Thank you very much. Everybody give it up for Josh. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. All right. All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. This is a great turnout. I really appreciate it. I love all of you, except for the ones of you who I don't know. Hopefully, I will love you by the end of this talk. We'll see. So if you guys don't know me, I normally run this event. I do all the bookings. I bring in all the speakers. Brandon is one of our best Liberty activists. He is guest hosting for me tonight. And then he also runs the Liberty on the Rocks chapter up north. So I hope anyone up north can check that out. So this talk tonight is going to be sort of the spiritual successor to a talk I did about a year and a half ago, which was a talk on privacy. I did that talk on 24 hours notice, so it's a little rushed. This one is probably the opposite of that. I probably did way too much. It's a lot of stuff. My sort of niche that I occupy well is I know a little bit about a lot. I'm not really an expert on anything. This is just a topic that I've been casually following for the last 10 years, and I just find it really fascinating, so I want to cover sort of the whole gambit of crypto-anarchy. So with that, let's get started. So crypto-anarchy and the Cypherpunks. As you can see there, that is the crypto-anarchy flag. It's not really used much, but that is the official flag. And then that line there is the first line of the Crypto-Anarchist Manifesto. It is a tongue-in-cheek reference to the Communist Manifesto, actually. A specter is haunting the modern world, the specter of crypto-anarchy. It's not really true, but it was catchy. So what is crypto-anarchy? At a basic level, crypto-anarchy is pretty much using any sort of technology to advance freedom. I think that really sums it up, that alone is what crypto-anarchy is, but at a higher level, it focuses on privacy, encryption, and digital currency. Those are sort of the three main things. So this picture you see on the right, Rebels with a Cause, those were the original founders of the Cypherpunks on Wired magazine in 1993. And that is the three founders with their masks off. So from left to right, Timothy C. May, Eric Hughes, and John Gilmore. They were the three founders of crypto-anarchy. So the movement started primarily with Timothy C. May. Tim May was an Intel engineer. He was a physicist, and he discovered this thing called the alpha particle problem, which was basically that their chips were having a major problem because of radiation in the packaging. He essentially realized that this was happening. Intel they changed their packaging, and it fixed the problem. This was then extrapolated to pretty much all computer chip manufacturing from then on, and this was this massive breakthrough in the 80s. So Tim May basically got super rich. He retired by the time he was 35, read a lot of books. He was heavily inspired by Ayn Rand, by Friedrich Hayek, and by cyberpunk like Snow Crash or Neuromancer. So getting into that, he started realizing that technology was headed in a really bad direction, and he didn't like the way it was going. So he met up with his friend Eric Hughes, and they decided to do an in-person meetup to discuss these ideas. They called their friend John Gilmore, and then the three of them met up at Eric Hughes' house in Southern California. So during this meeting, Eric proposed the name of Cryptology Amateurs for Social Irresponsibility, which is just awful. So they didn't go with that. It was actually Jude Meehan, who was Eric's girlfriend at the time, and a cypherpunk in her own right, who called them cypherpunks as sort of a joking insult. It was sort of a combination of cyberpunk, which is more of an aesthetic or a style, and cipher, which is encrypted text. So here's sort of a quick little timeline. So in the top left here you see Tim May writes the Crypto-Anarchist Manifesto, 1988. He wrote that before they actually met. So the original idea was sort of his, and then he met up with Eric after that. They launched the Cypherpunk mailing list in 1992. 1993, Eric Hughes writes Cypherpunk's Manifesto and coins the phrase Cypherpunks write code. And then 1994, Tim May wrote the Cyphernomicon, which extrapolates out the ideas. The Cyphernomicon is mostly an FAQ. It's not super interesting. It's like a book. But if you haven't read a Cypherpunks manifesto, definitely check it out. It's only about a page long. The Crypto-Anarchist manifesto is also only about a page long, but the Cypherpunk manifesto is, in my opinion, better written. It very much talks about secrecy and privacy and the difference between the two, and how crypto-anarchists are going to make this happen. The picture there, that is Tim May. He is coming down as Moses with the Cyphernomicon on the two tablets. So the founding ideas, again, are primarily free speech, privacy, and digital currency. And the cypherpunks essentially decided that these things were not being built fast enough, so they were going to try and do it themselves. So the contributions of the founders, in the bottom left, you can see their pictures again. What's interesting about them is they coined this term, cypherpunk write code. But they didn't actually write that much code, which was interesting. Eric Hughes was a coder. He did write code. He wrote one of the first remailers for email, so it was one of the first ways to do private email at the time. But other than that, he's not really known for doing a whole lot of publicly available code. Tim May was a physicist, not a coder, so he was mostly a writer and a little bit of an agitator. He was known to be very brash in his rhetoric. Now, John Gilmore, on the other hand, is pretty interesting. He's in some ways the least known of the three founders, but he was a co-founder of the EFF. He had actually founded the EFF before starting the Cypherpunks movement, and the EFF has been probably the biggest think tank for any sort of crypto digital advocacy in the last 30, 35 years. And one thing that they've done in particular is they created a service called Let's Encrypt. Let's Encrypt and Certbot, if you guys are familiar with that, that's sort of the primary method of encrypting for self-hosters or small companies. You can get free digital certs to have encryption on the internet. So that's one of the biggest contributions they have made. So the Cypherpunks were very much known for their mailing list that started in '94. At its peak, they had about 2,000 members, and Tim May more or less became the de facto leader of the entire movement and the mailing list. He would very much try to moderate the list with all sorts of ideas and keep people in line and keep discussion going. By Tim May's own estimation, the list was approximately 50% libertarian, 20% left, and the rest was unknown. And then, unfortunately, following 9/11, the movement lost a lot of its influence. It continued on in another form in the cryptography newsletters, but the cypherpunks kind of fell out of fashion a little bit after 9/11. So we're not really focusing on these guys, but these are some additional cypherpunks. These are guys who were on the Cypherpunks mailing list, and they've all had some pretty interesting contributions, but they're not really the focus of this talk, so just want to mention them. Zuko Wilcox O'Hearn, creator of Zcash. He also worked for DigiCash. Moxie Marlinspike, which, man, every time I read that name, it sounds like a Pokemon. But he was the founder of Signal and the creator of the Signal protocol. And then Bruce Schneier, who is a security researcher and cryptographer. He's very well known in the cryptography space, the security space. You know, he created some cryptography himself. I believe it was Blowfish. And then he also, ironically, does not like Bitcoin. If you've ever read anything from him, he hates Bitcoin. He thinks it's a scam. So it's kind of interesting because he was one of the original cypherpunks who hates Bitcoin. And then Jacob Applebaum, who is a Tor developer who worked closely with WikiLeaks, he's kind of disappeared. He got a lot of accusations of sexual misconduct by people at the Tor Foundation, and he's kind of disappeared since then. So before we kind of get into more of the cypherpunks, we're going to talk about some of the inspirations for the cypherpunks. And I think that there's four main technologies that really inspired them. So the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which came out in 1976, created the idea of asynchronous cryptography. Chaumian and eCash, which is the first private digital cash, first proposed by David Chaum in 1982. The start of the free and open source FOSS movement, which is usually credited to Richard Stallman. That was 1985. PGP, Pretty Good Privacy, created by Phil Zimmerman in 1993. So, ironically, none of these people ever considered themselves cypherpunks. They probably created some of the biggest contributions to the cypherpunk movement, but they all generally rejected the label. In particular, David Chaum found that the cypherpunks were a little too edgy for him, and he never really identified as one. All right, so before we get into some of these concepts, we're just going to do a basic encryption primer. So at the top, a hash, a one-way mathematical function that verifies data. So a hash is basically, it allows you to test if data has been modified. So there's a lot of free sites that will do this for you. So one of my favorites is called VirusTotal. If you go on there, you can throw a file on there. It will also check it to see if it has any sort of malicious software in there, and then it will give you a hash. So what you can do with this software is anytime, let's say you have a Word document, if anything in that file changes, you run it through a hash, your hash will be completely different. If you add a period or a space, completely different hash. So this is a way of verifying files whether or not they've changed. So encryption, you probably all know what that is, but it's a basic mathematical process that scrambles data to make it unreadable. The first known encryption was created by Julius Caesar called the Caesar cipher. It's the first one that we know of by name anyways, which was a very basic cipher. It was you would just shift one to the right or two to the right. So A would become C, B would become D, and so on. So it's very simple. Symmetric encryption is where you use the same key to lock and unlock a file. If you think of a password, that's sort of an easy way to understand it. You would lock it with a password. You unlock it with a password. Asymmetric encryption uses two different keys. So one key to lock it, one key to unlock it. And this was a revolution, was asymmetric encryption. And then we have digital signatures, which are how you would sign messages with a private key. So this is how you can prove ownership of a file digitally, cryptographically, that was secure. If you see on the right there, there's the Little Orphan Annie secret decoder ring. If you guys remember the movie A Christmas Story, this was a big plot point in the movie. And this was actually a real thing in the 30s. There's Little Orphan Annie's Secret Society, where they would send out these little decoder rings. So that was sort of an example of very low-level cryptography that they used to do prior to when cryptography became digital. All right, so the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, 1976. Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman, they created a paper. And in this paper, they basically bragged that we are on the threshold of a rapidly new industry. So they were very aware that this asymmetric cryptography was going to be a big deal. So what this did was it allowed two parties that have no prior knowledge of each other to establish a shared secret over an insecure channel. So prior to Diffie-Hellman, it was thought that this was impossible. Basically, the only way that you could have cryptography was I had to meet you in person or send it to you somehow, the private key that we would use to decode information. Diffie-Hellman allowed that to happen where two people who don't know each other and don't have an encrypted method of talking to each other can exchange those keys. It gets really complicated when you actually look into it. I've watched the explanation for Diffie-Hellman like 10 times, and I still don't quite get it. Just trying to do the math. I feel like almost no one actually understands the cryptography. But anyways, this basically created the idea of public key cryptography, also known as PKI. This is used by the internet all day, every day, so everybody uses this without even knowing it. Anytime you sign up for a new website, you log into your Chase Bank, you're using PKI, and you're using public key cryptography. RSA was another algorithm that was similar to Diffie-Hellman, had the key exchange, but also provided encryption as well. So the next one, Chaumian eCash. It's David Chaum on the left there. He was the CEO of DigiCash. So he published his Untraceable Electronic Mail paper in 1981. And then in 1982, he published a paper on blind signatures for untraceable payments. So basically what this was, we mentioned digital signatures. This was a blind digital signature. So the signature would still correspond to your private key, but you could hide who you actually were with it. So this was this revolutionary new thing at the time that you could basically send people money privately and digitally. Now, the problem with this is you needed a trusted third party. You needed a bank to validate the money, and then you needed Chaum, or Chaum's company, DigiCash, to validate the private currency on top of it. So there's essentially two security holes there. So DigiCash used a system called eCash. That was the name of the system, but then the money was actually called Cypherpunks, and then the company was DigiCash, and then it's usually referred to as Chaumian eCash. So it actually gets a little confusing if you're trying to follow all of it. So 1984, the company was started. The system was in use in small and limited cases. David Chaum, who was the CEO, he had major talks with banks like Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, Visa, and Microsoft, but they never really materialized. By most accounts, David Chaum was a terrible CEO and a terrible businessman. He was this brilliant cryptographer, just heads and shoulders above everybody else, but he was a really bad businessman. He talked to Microsoft, and the rumor was that he asked for $2 for every copy of Windows XP sold, which got him turned down flat. So by 1998, there was only 300 merchants that were using it. 500 users through the Mark Twain Bank were active in the system. Now, they tried to save the company. Chaum was removed as CEO, but ultimately DigiCash declared bankruptcy shortly after, and the system was never really used. Chaumian eCash is also proprietary, so anyone else who wanted to use the system had to license it from David Chaum. And that was a bit of a problem from the Cypherpunks because they were too radical for Chaum. Chaum was much more of a lefty. He cared about privacy, but he was not about anarchy or anything like that. All right, free and open source. That's Richard Stallman there on the left. He was a MIT hacker. This is actually one of the few pictures where he's not with a giant beard and really long hair. So he worked at the MIT lab back in the 80s, and he really liked the hacker culture that was there. This hacker culture developed, and basically they considered it sort of an anarchist culture. They were all very friendly. They would share software. They were all brilliant guys all hanging out together who really valued these computer systems. As proprietary software started to come in, that started to change. Some of the guys who left basically started poaching a bunch of the people who worked at the MIT lab, and Richard Stallman took this very personally. He was very dramatic in a lot of cases, talking about how he would be better off dead than without his MIT lab. And then I put this quote in here. The non-hackers reacted to this by turning to commercial systems, bringing with them fascism and license agreements, which I kind of agree with, but I also thought was hilarious because it was so dramatic. So Richard actually, he basically countered all of these guys who left by doing the work of 6 programmers to keep the MIT lab software up to date with the proprietary software. So he was this brilliant coder, and he was able to keep the MIT lab going for a little while. But ultimately, he realized that that wasn't sustainable long term, and he created the Free Software Foundation in 1985. He would also create GNU, which is GNU's Not Unix. Yes, that is a recursive acronym. It's a little confusing. And that was a competitor to proprietary Unix software at the time. This would eventually lead to the creation of Linux, which was done by Linus Torvald a few years later. And then in the 90s, free software was later rebranded to open source, which he hated. He liked free software, not free open source software. PGP, also known as Pretty Good Privacy, kind of a goofy name. But Phil Zimmermann was actually a lefty anti-nuclear demonstrator who was working on PGP as a side project. Now, in 1991, there was a omnibus crime bill that was being pushed by our favorite Delaware Senator Joe Biden that would effectively criminalize encryption. So Zimmermann did what anyone would do and worked really hard to get the software done before the bill went through, which is actually pretty heroic. So he got the software up and running, and he launched it before the bill actually went through. Over the next 3 years, he was very much subject to political pressure. He was pulled in front of Congress a few times to testify about encryption and whether or not people should have it and what his role was in it. During that time, a young cypherpunk by the name of Hal Finney actually helped to develop PGP 2.0, and he did this completely anonymously. Phil was trying to protect Hal from any possible prosecution because Phil didn't honestly know what was going to happen to him. So he was kept in legal limbo for a couple years as a potential violation of ITAR, which is the International Traffic in Arms Regulation. So basically, the government looked at cryptography the same way they would look at missiles. So can't send a missile to Iraq, also can't send them cryptography. That's how the federal government looked at it. So Phil's case was eventually dropped. He was never actually charged with anything. And there was never an official reason given for why the case was dropped, but the sort of thesis was he had published PGP, the code base, into a book, and that was legal. You were allowed to publish encryption in books because that was free speech. That was protected under the First Amendment. So basically, most people speculate that Congress and the government realized we're going to lose this case if we actually go and litigate. And they just dropped it at that point because they knew it was kind of a losing battle. So that brings us to the crypto wars. So the cypherpunks rallied to the defense of Zimmer and PGP. They thought this was absolutely egregious, and they did everything that they could to fight back. So it was illegal to send code out of the country, but again, it wasn't illegal to publish code into books. So a lot of people would post this into books. They would also make shirts, and Adam Back actually posted the RSA code in his email signature. So if you see there on the right side, that is a screenshot, I believe, from originally Adam Back's email with some Linux code in there, basically saying, fuck you guys, I'm posting this and emailing this to everyone I can. And theoretically, it was legal as long as he was sending it to anyone in the US, but if they were outside the US, it wasn't. And then you see some people wore the shirt there on the bottom right. Some people even got tattoos of RSA, like on their stomach or on their back. So in addition to that, the feds tried another scheme, the Clipper chip and key escrow. So the Clipper chip essentially would have been in probably all computers, all TVs, everything that they could get it into, and that would basically give the NSA backdoor access into every single device. So every single device, they would have the private keys, and they could access your device directly. Key escrow was a similar thing where they essentially wanted to be the escrow partner for your private keys. So anytime me and Bob create a private key, the government's there too. They get a copy of my private key so that they can always read my data. Now, in 1996, a cypherpunk by the name of Matt Blaze discovered a major vulnerability in the Clipper chip, that all the data was extremely vulnerable and anybody could hack this. And from that moment on, the program pretty much lost all political support and was dead. So Crypto Wars Part 2. So this has actually been going on a lot longer. When people talk about the Crypto Wars, they're usually talking about the early 90s and the cypherpunks fight for cryptography. But really, the NSA has been fighting cryptography for its entire existence. So if you look at Project Minaret and Project Shamrock, those are two clandestine NSA projects that basically gave them full access to all telecommunications in the United States. So encryption threatened this. They could read basically anything, they could listen to anything, and then all of a sudden this thing called encryption came along, and they couldn't read it. and they didn't like that at all. So they had artificially kept encryption standards much weaker. So prior to 1990, they used the Data Encryption Standard, or DES, which was considered to be relatively weak even at the time, and nobody was allowed to do any sort of competitive cryptography, or the NSA would more or less go after you. So in the 70s, after Whitfield Diffie published his paper, there was a rogue NSA agent who heavily implied to him in person that bad things might happen to him if he were to keep going this route. Now, the official story is that was a rogue NSA agent, but we don't really know that. The NSA denied it for years, and then Whitfield believed he was a rogue one. But ultimately, Whitfield didn't know what was going to happen to him. He was getting calls from the NSA. They didn't like what he was doing. They didn't like this idea of cryptography being out in the public and people being able to view it. So actually, a few of his students who continued to publish in cryptography, Ralph Merkle, who created Merkle trees, didn't end up giving his presentation about Merkle trees that he created because they didn't know what the legal ramifications of this might be. So because Whitfield was the professor at the school, he gave the presentation for Merkle because they were just so afraid of what the NSA might do to go after him. So in 1998, the FF basically sponsored a giant movement that cracked DES. They were essentially able to prove that DES was insecure. It took a lot of brainpower, a lot of money to get this done. That was in 1998. But once this was done publicly, the NSA basically relented, and they sponsored the creation of AES, which is sort of the current level of encryption that we use. AES is the Advanced Encryption Standard. That's what most computers use now for encrypting data at rest. It's pretty standard. Almost everybody uses this. I don't know if you guys follow Tom Woods at all. He's one of my favorite podcasters. But on the podcast, he does an ad, and he's like, they use military-grade encryption, and they store it in bunkers. I'm like, yeah, it's just AES. That's what everybody uses. I mean, it is military grade. It's not untrue, but I always find it a little funny. All right, so that leads us to assassination markets and Jim Bell. It's my wife. So in 1995, Jim Bell authored the paper Assassination Politics. Now, Jim Bell was a little crazy, as you might guess, from this particular topic. Jim Bell also worked at Intel, and he had worked with Tim May, and he knew Tim May personally. So the idea was that anonymous benefactors could order or pay for assassinations of people, particularly politicians. It worked by offering a reward that could be claimed by someone who was willing to submit an entry predicting a given person's death at a particular time. If that person died at about that time, the correct bettor would win the pool money. So they would essentially reveal that they were the ones who had put the money up for the specific time, and that they would get the bounty. Now, other people would have to sponsor this, right? So let's say you had a bounty for random politician, not going to name any names, but random politician, and there's a bunch of encrypted predictions for when this person will die, but you can't see any of them. So other people would then fund this, ideally anonymously. They would then fund this proposition, and let's say it gets up to $1 million. Well, once it's up to $1 million, now there's some serious motivation to take this person out. So the assumption was that the person who took this out would then reveal their private keys, and it would show, I predicted this person would die at this time, at this place, with this method. Boom, they win the contract, they get the money. So now this was highly theoretical and obviously very dangerous. It actually got some high praise from Wired magazine, an unholy mix of encryption, anonymity, and digital cash to bring about the ultimate annihilation of all forms of government. Who knew Wired was so based, right? And then the Chrysler Award, which is like not a tech magazine, but they said an imaginative and sophisticated perspective for improving governmental accountability, which is objectively true. So Bill was arrested and jailed by the IRS 2 later for unrelated financial crimes. He was actually able to prove in court that the ATF had illegally wiretapped him. On one occasion, they did it multiple times, but he wasn't necessarily able to prove it on all the occasions. Now, Bell is an interesting character because this basically ruined his life. He was a genius, but he was a crazy person, and he spent most of the rest of his life in and out of jail. He actually claims to have invented a new form of fiber optics that will change the world, and he's been screaming about that for years. I can't remember if he's actually in prison or not right now, but he didn't really do too much after this. Most of the Cypherpunks actually disavowed him. They felt that it was just too brash, it was too much bad attention. Tim May wouldn't openly support him, but he pretty much did support him. He just thought that Jim Bell was too much of an idiot and he shouldn't have posted this publicly, but May pretty much supported him. Oh, and Zimmerman specifically said, Jim Bell's the only person who made me regret the creation of PGP because there's people like Jim Bell out there. So you can see Zimmerman was not as radical as everyone else was. Okay, so that leads us to internet piracy and BitTorrent. So 1999, Napster launched. This was the first thing that allowed people to pirate. It was a centralized service. It was primarily known for music. By 2002, Napster had to file for bankruptcy after multiple laws for copyright infringement. Now, that, of course, didn't stop with Napster. As I'm sure you all remember, anyone around my age might recognize these logos in the bottom right-hand corner. LimeWire, FrostWire, BearShare, Kazaa. I don't know if you guys remember these, but when I discovered these in high school, oh my God, the internet's free. This is such a cool thing now. It's also really ironic because LimeWire gave out a free version, but you could use the free version to download the legal full version. And so they destroyed their own business model with LimeWire. But all of these services ultimately would end up getting shut down because they were highly centralized and they were violating the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So in 2001, Bram Cohen launched the BitTorrent protocol, which was a decentralized way of sharing files. So now this still runs today. This is totally legal. It's a legal protocol. People use it all the time. The way they targeted it is they went after centralized repositories of people sharing these files. So in the top right there, you see the Pirate Bay. The Pirate Bay is the most notorious site. They've been trying to take them down for 15 to 20 years. It's still up and running. You can go to it right now. You can download whatever you want from the Pirate Bay. There's a lot of other ones that they've gone after. There's been a lot of lawsuits. People have gotten arrested. Metallica, they kind of led this war, if you recall, back in the early 2000s against piracy. But ultimately, this fight has already been lost. This fight was lost the moment Napster launched. Digital technology cannot be constrained in this way. So, digital currency, the cypherpunk dream. So, in 1997, Adam Back, who was a known cypherpunk, he wrote on the mailing list that a digital currency would need to include the following. So, 1, it needs to be anonymous, privacy preserving, payee and payer anonymous. 2, distributed, hard to shut down. 3, have some built-in scarcity. This refers to the double spend problem as digital scarcity, but also inflation. So the double spend problem is the idea that we just talked about, that you can't stop someone from sharing a digital file. You can't stop the signal. I want to send a file to everyone in this room. You give me your emails, I can send that file to you. So digital scarcity is this sort of revolutionary concept that doesn't normally exist in digital, is how do we make things scarce, but still digital? And then, of course, inflation is just printing the money supply. So there has to be a limit to this digital money. It must require no trust of any one individual, no trusted third parties like eCash. eCash was heavily flawed because you had to trust banks and you had to trust David Chaum's DigiCash. Preferably offline, which he acknowledged was difficult to do with pure software, and then also it needed to be reusable in some way. So that leads us to a couple centralized alternative currencies. So these really prove the need for a decentralized currency. So if you see on the right there, eGold, the primary source of eGold, omnipay.com. So this was a project that launched in 1995. At its peak, it was worth about $2 billion. A lot of people in the US used it, and they got raided in 2005. Now, prior to getting raided, they had reached out to the IRS and the SEC asking for compliance. They asked, hey, what do we have to do to keep our business up and running? They never got anything back. The IRS just showed up and raided them and shut them down, took all of the physical gold. This was gold-backed digital currency that they used. So they went to litigation and they settled. So the founders never actually did any jail time, but part of the settlement was that they would have to apply for a money transmitter license after the settlement to get their company up and running, which they agreed to. They all got house arrest, paid some fines. Once this was done, they went and applied for a money transmitter license, and they were denied because they were now felons. So, bit of a catch-22. Now, they actually didn't know that they needed a money transmitter license because this was 2005, and the money transmitter license came through with the Patriot Act. So a lot of people didn't know that this was a real thing, and their company had been around since 1995. And they had been operating totally legally for 5 years, and then all of a sudden it was illegal, and they had no idea. So another one was Liberty Dollar, 1998. Bernard von Nothaus, I think that's his real name. But this was the American Liberty Dollars. They also used digital currency, the electric Liberty Dollar. And then they were shut down in 2009. Bernard was specifically charged with counterfeiting and for making coins resembling and similar to United States coins. Luckily, Bernard was given house arrest. So if you see on the right there, that's some of the physical cash that they actually made. And I actually have a Liberty Dollar right here. It's worth $20 in silver. But we inherited this from a friend. It says, Trust in God, 2008. We. And libertydollar.org. So it's actually a real little Liberty Dollar. So it was kind of a cool little prop that I realized I had. And then the other one was Liberty Reserve, which was launched in Costa Rica by Arthur Budowski, who is a man already convicted of financial crimes in the U.S. And his service launched in 2006 was shut down in 2013. So Liberty Reserve operated all over the world. It had 1 million users, 20% of them from the US, but there was also a lot of organized crime that used them. There's also a lot of legitimate business as well, but even being outside the US won't save you. He was in Costa Rica, the feds shut him down. So that leads us to the idea of decentralized currency. So these were a few of the ideas that were discussed prior to the creation of the decentralized currency. So 1979, already mentioned it, Merkle trees, created by Ralph Merkle. This created a hash chain for data validation. So it'd be hashes upon hashes, so you can validate multiple files, not just one. 1997 was Hashcash, which essentially created proof of work by Adam Back. So this was actually originally designed to be anti-spam software for email. So at one point, I think in 2010, 80% of all email was spam. Now, in the 90s, they realized that this was going to be a massive problem. So what Adam Back did is he created this thing called proof of work that essentially required you to do a little bit of computer computation before sending out an email. The problem with this was you had to do it all or not at all. So everyone needed to implement proof of work on email or it wouldn't work at all. So if I just implement Hashcash, nobody can get my emails. So if me and Joe and Bob, then we can all email each other, but we can't email anyone outside of it. So it's sort of a chicken and an egg problem. Everyone or no one. So 1998, Nick Szabo launches Bitcold. Now Bitcold was never actually, it was only theoretical. It never got out of the idea phrase, but it was the idea of creating a decentralized digital currency system based on cryptographic proof. Nick was also interesting that he was the first person to talk about the idea of smart contracts, which is something that we now see on Ethereum and other crypto projects. And then he coined the term, trusted third parties are security holes, which is something that I think we've learned a lot in the last few years, trusting some of these centralized exchanges. 1998, Wei Dai and B-Money, which is a theoretical decentralized digital currency system. It outlines the basic properties of all modern day cryptocurrency. And then 2005 was reusable proof of works. Hal Finney created a working centralized prototype to test this, but unfortunately it was centralized and never got too far beyond that. So this is a cool little graph I found. It's a Bitcoin prehistory. It's about 40 different years of all the different tech. I don't know if you guys can actually read any of this. It's a little small. Okay, yeah. It's a really cool graph, and unfortunately, yeah, I can barely read it. But it's a lot of the stuff we already talked about, and it also kind of looks like a spaceship. So that's kind of fun. But basically, it's just all the things we talked about, some other things, 1996, NSA, how to make a mint, that kind of stuff. So that leads us to Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash. So I assume everyone here has probably heard of Bitcoin. Bitcoin was launched in 2009 by an anonymous person or persons by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto. This was initially published on the successor to the Cypherpunk mailing list, which was called the Cryptography list. This incorporated several of the ideas from the Cypherpunk mailing list into a new project, and with this invention, the first truly decentralized money was created. The first person to use this was Hal Finney, so the guy who had worked on PGP 2.0 and RPO. So you can see there on the right, that is the Twitter post from Hal Finney running Bitcoin. That's all he said. January 11, 2009. It now has 16,000 likes, which it did not have at the time. So a lot of people have gone back and re-liked that tweet. So this project largely reinvigorated the cypherpunk movement. It had been largely stagnant since 9/11. And then for the first 2 years of Bitcoin, Satoshi was sort of the guiding oracle. He was still an anonymous person. He, she, they was anonymous, but disappeared after 2 years. Satoshi now is, I believe, the 20th richest person in the world, which is sort of a fascinating idea that this anonymous group or person is the 20th richest. The market cap of Bitcoin is, when I checked today, $1.4 trillion. And if Bitcoin gets up to a value of 200,000, Satoshi will be the richest man in the world, which again, I find absolutely fascinating. And what I really hope happens is that we get to this 200,000 number or somewhere above that. Satoshi becomes the richest man in the world, and then he finally actually logs into his crypto, to his wallet, and just sends his Bitcoin to all these freedom projects all over the world. I'm making that prediction. That's what he's going to do when he becomes the richest man in the world, is fund all these decentralized open source projects all over the world. I'm really hoping it happens. So for better or worse, Bitcoin launched an entire new industry. There was a lot of different other coins that were launched, a lot of other projects, some scams, better or worse. It's made things very interesting, which leads us to the next one, Ethereum, which is a next generation smart contract platform. Now, a lot of people don't like Ethereum. They think that it leads to a lot of bad incentives, shall I say. Now, Ethereum launched in 2016 following the white paper by Vitalik Buterin. Now, it's similar to Bitcoin in the fact that it's this decentralized cryptocurrency, but the primary difference between Ethereum is that it gives users the ability to run smart contracts. So you can do things on top of Bitcoin. It makes it easy to create other tokens. Or you could run something like Tornado Cash. So Tornado Cash was a privacy service built on top of Ethereum that got shut down by the feds, and it's still running because it was built into a smart contract that can't be stopped on Ethereum. So now, Ethereum is often criticized as being less cypherpunk or freedom-focused. So you see in the bottom right there, I have cypherpunks versus degens. So degens is a term referred to people who just gamble on all of this crypto and DeFi, and cypherpunks are what we're talking about, the people that are in it for the liberty, for the freedom. Now, in defense of Ethereum's cypherpunk status, is one, Tornado Cash, these things can't be stopped. But two, if you see the picture on the top right there, those are the smaller units of Ether. So if you see some of those, there's Babbage, Lovelace, Shannon, those are all computing pioneers. But then we have Szabo, Finney, and then Wei for Wei Dai. Those are cypherpunks. So they specifically named parts of Ethereum after the cypherpunks. So that is in their history that they did build that, even though I will fully acknowledge a lot of the Ethereum community is less cypherpunk, and they're more about degenning or cool tech. Another interesting thing is Farcaster versus Nostr. So Farcaster is a decentralized social media built on Ethereum. Nostr is basically the Bitcoin decentralized social media. It's not built on Bitcoin, but it utilizes Bitcoin, and all the Bitcoiners love it. So that's sort of an interesting thing to kind of track going forward, is to see how those two will work. The Nostr community is very passionate. It's like 98% Bitcoin. If you get on there, it's pretty much just all Bitcoin all day. And then Farcaster seems pretty empty, but Farcaster has a lot of institutional money. There's a lot of money in the Ethereum community, a lot of venture capital. So it'll be interesting to see which way that goes. So that leads us to Monero, which might be my favorite project. 2014, an anonymous person, Nicholas Van Saberhagen, quietly released Monero. Now, Monero went through some growth. It wasn't the Monero we know and love today when it first launched. But even at the time, it had many of the same qualities as Bitcoin. It's limited supply, no pre-mine, used proof of work, and it had predictable inflation. It was different in a few other ways. So one thing is it has a tail emission. This is for long-term funding of miners. And what that essentially means is when you do proof of work, you get paid a certain amount of Bitcoin on Bitcoin. This is also true on Monero. But eventually, that Bitcoin runs out. And now on Bitcoin, you get paid by the fees. For Monero, you get paid by fees, but also they basically create a little bit of extra Monero to continue to pay you while the network keeps going. So it's basically long-term funding is the idea behind it, because they've actually run out already. So anytime, if you do any Monero mining, you run out of the block rewards in Monero, whereas Bitcoin still has the block rewards. You see right there, that's the block reward for Bitcoin, 3.125. That's how many you get every time you mine a block on Bitcoin. So there's a lot of other things. RandomX to prevent ASIC mining, built-in scaling method for dynamic block sizes, and then, of course, the number one thing that Monero is known for is extreme privacy. Ring signatures, confidential transactions, and stealth addresses are the three things that make Monero almost impossible to trace. Stealth addresses, interestingly enough, were created by Adam Back for Bitcoin, but they were never utilized on Bitcoin. So in a lot of ways, I think Monero is the most cypherpunk, more cypherpunk than Bitcoin. It's not to say it's necessarily better. They have different features. But I do think that when we look at privacy and that being such a key part of the cypherpunk movement, Monero is the best for privacy. If you see the picture on the right there, that's Paralini Polis. You can't see the words on the top there, but it's called the Institute of Crypto-Anarchy. That's in Prague. They got a little Monero sticker there. So the people who run the Institute of Crypto-Anarchy think Monero's the best, is the endorsement, I assume. So that leads us to Tor, the onion router. So Tor is it was a network initially launched by the Navy. The code was released on a free license in 2004, and then 2006, the Tor Foundation was founded and heavily funded by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So this basically gave everyone a private browser. It would create relays, and it would have this highly complex layer of transactions. So you see in the top left there, there's an onion. It's like an onion. It had onion layers. So basically, this was this great privacy tool. It was utilized heavily by WikiLeaks and by the darknet markets. And then also the first actual assassination market was launched on Tor in 2013. So if you see on the bottom right there, that is a picture from the actual market. That was a hit that somebody attempted on Ben Bernanke, the Fed chair at the time. And the payout was 124 Bitcoin at the time, which would have been 75,000 at the time, and a whole lot more than that now. Now, as far as we know, there was no assassinations ever committed on this particular website, and the creator a few years ago shut down or a few years after shut down the website and took all the money. He essentially exit scammed. So he got a big payout, and nothing happened. So Anonymous and the hacktivists. So now this one's a little interesting because this isn't necessarily cypherpunks, but I feel like it's related enough that it's important to talk about. So in the early 2000s, there was a website called 4chan. You guys might be familiar with it. It was this terrible website. Everybody on there was anonymous. It posted all sorts of memes. Kind of one of the goals on there was to post the most disgusting and disturbing things you could think of. That's what was posted on 4chan. Specifically it's like a subreddit. It was Reddit before Reddit, called /b, which was random. So people would post all these random things on there. And this kind of led to a lot of trolling. So they like to troll people. That was the thing they did. They trolled each other, and they would troll other people. This sort of started to graduate, and they started trolling real people, not just on the website. Now, this started out with neo-Nazis, the Westboro Baptists, and Scientology. So Scientology was a big one. It was a project called Project Technology. And this ended up being worldwide. So they organized in-person meetups all over the world. Anywhere between 200 to 1,000 people showed up at these meetups. If you see in the bottom right-hand corner there, they're all wearing the Guy Fawkes mask. This was based off of, well, obviously Guy Fawkes, who tried to overthrow the king, and that didn't go so well for him. But the movie V for Vendetta was sort of this idea that if we all show up anonymously, what are they going to do to us? So everybody was on the internet anonymously, and they met up in person and stayed anonymous. And then the top right there, you see that was their logo. They used to put out these videos that would say, "We are anonymous. We are Legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget. Expect us." You know, it was this very sort of creepy video that they would put out almost as a threat. If you guys have ever seen the TV show Mr. Robot, it's very much inspired by this movement. It's a great TV show, by the way. You should check it out. So this basically became a worldwide decentralized hacker movement. They would use things like DDoS to take down all sorts of websites. Also the Scientology thing, if you see the picture of Tom Cruise there, that was because they were responsible for leaking the Scientology video of Tom Cruise. If you guys remember this from like 2006, it was just a video of Tom just rambling about how only Scientologists can help. Only Scientologists know what's happening. And somebody put the Mission Impossible music in the background. So it's actually really funny, but it's still in line. Scientology went hard after this video to get it shut down. And this was basically the first instance of the Streisand effect, which wasn't even a term coined at the time, which is the more you try to suppress something, especially digital information, it just explodes. It gets away from you. That video, I think, has like 18 million views. And that's just one iteration of it. That video is up all over the place, and they've never been able to take it down. So now, eventually, Anonymous graduated to going after other people. They went after governments in the Middle East for the Arab Spring. They actually took down the FBI's website at one point, specifically in response to the FBI going after Mega Upload. And they took down the websites for Visa and PayPal, specifically in defense of WikiLeaks. A lot of these people ended up going to jail, as you might expect. A lot of these people were low-level hackers, just some guy who downloaded a DDoS software, pointed it at a website, had no idea what they're doing. 6 months later, FBI shows up at their door. They went to jail. There was a few high-level hackers that kind of did all this. There's actually, in one case, the lady from the Westboro Baptist Church, Sherry, I believe was her name. She was on a call with this left-wing podcaster, and live during the call, Anonymous hacked into their website and started posting a bunch of stuff. So if you guys remember Anonymous, it was kind of a wild thing to watch as it happened. It's mostly disappeared since, but it was a very interesting development. So, leads us to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. 2006, a whistleblowing site was launched by a hacker, a member of the Cypherpunk mailing list, Julian Assange. The site utilized Tor and PGP to protect its sources, and it published thousands of corporate and government documents. In 2010, Julian would release what became to be known as Cablegate, which was specifically showing the collateral murder videos committed by the US, and the US went after him very hard after that. So in 2011, they got targeted very heavily. They got completely deplatformed from all of their financial platforms. PayPal, Visa, everything took them off, and the only way they survived was by Bitcoin donations. So Bitcoin donations essentially kept them alive, and the use of Tor and PGP was how they protected all their sources. Julian would later go on to say that he made 50,000% profits off the donations. It's not sure if that was an increase in the donations or the increase in the price of Bitcoin. It wasn't clear. And he would later go on to call Bitcoin the real Occupy Wall Street. 2012, Julian was charged with sexual assault allegations, and he faced extradition to the United States. So Julian would specifically sneak out of, he was on house arrest at the time, he dyed his hair, he dyed his beard, and snuck out of the building, snuck into the Ecuadorian embassy, who gave him shelter for the next 7 years. And then following the 2016 elections and the Vault 7 leaks by the intelligence community, that made Julian an even bigger target than he was. Mike Pompeo, who was the head of the CIA at the time, specifically went after Julian as hard as he could over the Vault 7 leaks. They actually put cameras in every room of the Ecuadorian embassy, so every moment of Julian's life in there was surveilled. They actually stole his baby's diapers to test the DNA in the diapers to see if it was really Julian's baby, amongst many other things that they did while going after Julian. And then ultimately in 2019, he was arrested and thrown into jail in the UK. Next, Silk Road and the Darknet markets. So 2011, website was launched on Tor, known as the Darknet. The site facilitated the sale of drugs from anonymous providers in exchange for Bitcoin. 2013, site was shut down by the FBI, and Ross Ulbricht was arrested at a San Francisco library. Now, nobody knew who Ross Ulbricht was at the time, and a lot of people had their doubts. But eventually, when that went to trial, none of those doubts were allowed to be brought up. No one was allowed to talk about any of this. The theory that maybe there could have been another person running the website was never allowed to be heard in court. Most of the defenses were completely shut down. Everybody knows the trial was extremely corrupt. And Ross ultimately was sentenced to 2 life sentences, plus 40 years, and a $183 million fine. They don't talk about the fine much, because 2 life sentences plus 40 years. Ultimately, he essentially went to prison for running a website. One of the things that he was slandered with in the media was murder for hire. So now he was never actually charged with this. There is no proof that anyone died. There is no proof that even that he was the one who did this. It was found out later that multiple people had admin access to the site, including 2 very corrupt FBI agents who later went to prison for stealing Bitcoin from Ross. And shortly after the website went down, there were dozens of clones that popped up. Alphabet was a big one, Silk Road too. And then everyone that they've arrested since then has gotten significantly less time, 5 to 10 years in prison, whereas Ross they made an example of. And they were very open about this, that they made an example of this person so that they would stop other people from doing the same thing. So that leads us to Cody Wilson and the 3D gun printing movement. So in 2012, the law student Cody Wilson founded a company called Defense Distributed. And he announced the Wiki Weapon Project. Now, this was specifically inspired by Julian Assange. He wanted to create the WikiLeaks for guns. That was his idea with this project. In 2013, he first successfully fired the Liberator. It's the first 3D printed gun, top right corner. That is the Liberator there. And then now, much like Zimmerman and PGP, this was a clear violation of, Cody was forbidden from showing the 3D gun files due to ITAR restrictions. So we're back to that whole idea that code is a weapon. You can't send it to other people. And at this point, he wasn't allowed to post it on the internet at all. They went after him days after he initially posted it. And this was a violation of his First Amendment rights. This was the idea that we had seen in the Code Wars, that code is speech, and that you can't restrict code because you are restricting speech. You have a First Amendment right to say this. So Cody sued the ATF and the Department of Justice, and this case went on for about 5 years. The DOJ dragged their feet for as long as they could to keep this case going, and ultimately, in 2018, Cody won the lawsuit, to the surprise of many of us watching at the time, and the Department of Justice paid all of his legal fees. They effectively realized that they couldn't litigate this because, again, code is speech, and they would have to essentially destroy the First Amendment to go after the Second Amendment. This is something that Cody specifically talked about in the run-up to that I will make them destroy the First Amendment if they want to go after the Second Amendment. So he published the files on defcad.com, and the next day, he was sued by 20 state attorney generals. He countersued, and I believe a lot of that's still ongoing. He's winning, or he's won some of them. They're not all done, but in several different states, he's had to essentially limit access. This is very trivial to get around, but New Jersey is one. So if you live in the state of New Jersey, you cannot access defcad.com. Top left there is the little come and take it logo, repurposed for a digital file. Instead of come and take your guns, it's come and take your digital files. And I really like this quote from Cody that he said during all this. I'm trying to at least be able to say I fought it, you know? I fought as hard as I could, and I made them earn it. I made them stand there and say, we control the internet, and we control you. So after that, in 2018, Cody was arrested for sex crimes, as often happens in these cases. Now, in Cody's case, it was a statutory case. He was on a site called sugardaddydate.com, I believe, which required its users to be 18 years old. You had to be 18 to be on this website. In this case, the girl was not 18. She lied to Cody. She was 2 months under 17, which was the age of consent in Texas, which is where this happened. And Cody had every reason to believe that she was over 18. She told him she was 18. She told him she was a college student. You had to be 18 to be on the website. In Texas, that doesn't matter. Texas does not care. Intent doesn't matter. You did it, that's the end. So the event happened. A lot of people thought at the time that this might have been a setup by the ATF or the FBI or something like that. Cody's admitted this. He's like, no, this happened. I made a mistake. It's my fault. He immediately stepped down as the CEO from his company, Defense Distributed, right after this happened. In the bottom left, that is Cody in the middle. He was arrested in Taiwan, and this was before COVID, but he was wearing a mask, and he was going for a peak Unabomber, you know? He's like, if people didn't fear me enough, I want them to make sure they fear me when they arrest me, wearing this mask and glasses and hat. So in 2022, at the Guns and Bitcoin conference, Cody Wilson, he spoke anonymously as Dominica Yowles was the name he came up with. And as a side note, I was at this conference, and I was wearing a shirt that had Cody Wilson's face on it. And I felt like such an asshole wearing his face on my shirt that I didn't want to go talk to him, and I was super embarrassed. But it was really cool to see this talk, because it was such an interesting talk where he highlighted the Greeks' fascination with death and their desire to die beautifully in athletic competition. So if you can see the top left there, that's sort of this idea that you're walking this tightrope between death and freedom, that this is this incredibly difficult walk, but it's worth it in the end. So he said he essentially felt like he had died. He'd been killed socially. He'd been deplatformed from everything, and that he was okay with that it was all worth it. He actually had some other projects. There was Dark Wallet in 2013, which was one of the first attempts at a Bitcoin mixer. Never really worked, but that was a product that him and Amir Taki worked on. He also had a site called Hatreon, which was Patreon basically for right-wingers. So all these people who got deplatformed, you know, maybe Alex Jones or Richard Spencer, these kinds of guys, were all on Hatreon, and they were basically funding them through a Patreon service. Now, Visa went after them, shut it down. Cody was kicked off of Twitter in 2018. He was one of the first people that really got deplatformed, was Cody Wilson. So, and on the right there, you can see these are the covers for a documentary called Death Athletic. And the middle one there, again, talks about this idea of sports, this beautiful death through sports. So, highlighting a few well-known death athletes in this sort of tradition. Ross Ulbricht, been in prison since 2013 for the crime of running a website. Edward Snowden, who I didn't talk about much because I assume everyone's pretty aware of him, but ultimately he was exiled to Russia for the crime of exposing illegal corruption. And Julian Assange, who was stuck in an embassy for 7 years and now has been in solitary confinement in prison for 2019. And he's actually not charged with a crime at this time. There were a couple sex crimes, two of which passed the statute of limitations, and the other one was dropped after he was arrested in 2019, kind of showing that they never really cared about that was just sort of a means to an end. So that leads us to some modern death athletes, some people that have essentially given everything for freedom and the belief of freedom. So the first one I want to talk about is Roger Ver, who was at one time known as Bitcoin Jesus. Now, a lot of people don't like Roger Ver. Roger Ver was a very prominent player in the block size wars, and he didn't always make the best decisions during this time. He made a lot of enemies. He trusted some people he shouldn't have trusted. Like, that is for sure. I'm not dismissing that. But on the other hand, Roger Ver has funded all sorts of different Bitcoin projects, crypto projects. He gave a significant amount of money to Cody Wilson, to Ross Ulbricht, to Foundation for Economic Education. He's been one of the biggest activists in the world. He literally went to Mt. Gox and worked there trying to stop the company from failing. Now, he's a billionaire, and I think at the time he was probably a millionaire, but he went and spent his time and actually worked at Mt. Gox. Now, on the other hand, he also vouched that Mt. Gox was solvent, was clearly wrong on that one, so he's made some mistakes. But about 2 months ago, he was arrested for tax evasion in Spain. He is in the same prison that John McAfee was in when John McAfee got arrested and John McAfee died in. I haven't seen a lot of attention on the Roger Ver case, and I think it's very unfortunate because Roger is a great activist for liberty in a lot of ways, even though I do acknowledge some mistakes that he's made. So it leads us to two other ones, Samurai Wallets and Tornado Cash. So Samurai Wallet is a Bitcoin wallet that provided Bitcoin privacy services. In 2024, the site was taken down, and the two devs from Samurai Wallet were arrested. Now, these devs were actually very anonymous. They went out of their way to be as anonymous as they could. At the Guns and Bitcoin conference, the dev known as Samurai, he wore a mask every time he spoke. He didn't publish his face anywhere. This was a guy who was very much living this privacy thing that he was working on. So now with Samurai Wallet, it's interesting because it's been long known that coin joins mixers are illegal. So if we send our Bitcoin to a centralized service and they mix it and send it back, that's illegal. People have been arrested for that. The primary distinction here is custody. So whoever has custody, if I send it to someone else and they have custody, that's illegal. Now, what Samurai Wallet did is it never took custody. It would essentially create a little pool of a few different addresses. You'd put your Bitcoin in the pool. Samurai never had any control over it, and it would exchange Bitcoin for other Bitcoin with other anonymous users, and it would send it back to you. That's what they did. And by every interpretation of the law, that was legal at the time. The feds have essentially decided that it's not, that custody is no longer the defining factor. And so these two devs who work for Samurai are looking at 25 years in prison. Another unfortunate thing with this is that all the services are down and the feds have full access to everything. So there's a specific file in Bitcoin called the XPub that the feds might have, which might let them rewind transactions, essentially. So if you have used this service, the feds might now know that you used this service, this privacy service, when they went after Samurai. So now Tornado Cash is sort of a similar kind of thing. This is August 2022. This was built as a smart contract on Ethereum. Same idea, where the devs realized that custody was sort of the legal issue. They never took custody. They had this privacy front end called Tornado Cash that made it very easy. Now, they actually went out of their way to try and comply with the feds because shortly before that time, there was I forget which agency it was, but there was basically a blacklist of some North Korean IPs. So they basically made sort of like a KYC portal that blocked all IPs from Korea. Now, of course, tangibly, this doesn't actually do anything. It's very easy to get around this. But they made best efforts to block people that were not friendly to the US government. Didn't matter. They got shut down. Now, the Tornado Cash front end is down, but the Tornado Cash smart contract is still running. You can go use Tornado Cash right now. I wouldn't recommend it. They can track your Ethereum before you send in Tornado Cash, right? So they're probably monitoring that for any known US people if they were to send into that particular smart contract, and they might go after you. But it's interesting to see that Samurai Wallet, which was a great project, is completely shut down and didn't survive the Fed crackdown, whereas Tornado Cash, the thing that is less cypherpunk, is still running and is still usable. So just a few modern cypherpunks, the people I find pretty interesting. This is by no means an exhaustive list. Seth, for privacy, hosts a podcast, works for Passport, and he writes at freedom.tech. Matt Odell, he's a hardcore Bitcoin guy, hosts the Rabbit Hole Recap podcast, Citadel Dispatch, co-founder of OpenSats, and a partner at 1031. OpenSats is really cool. They fund open source tech, a lot of Bitcoin stuff, but also some other just general FOSS projects. And then 1031 is specifically for funding different Bitcoin-focused companies. Jameson Lopp, CTO and founder of Casa, which is a hardware wallet for Bitcoin and Ethereum. He's a board member of C4, and he writes a great blog at Cypherpunk Cognitions. You should check that one out. Michael Bazell, who's not really a cypherpunk in the political sense, but everything he does is really good stuff. It's all privacy-focused, privacy, security, OSINT, that's his stuff. He writes some of the best stuff on it, but he stays pretty neutral politically. Gabriel Custodiet, great podcast, Watchman Privacy. Eric Voorhees, you guys might know him. Venice.ai, a privacy-focused AI, and then former CEO of Shapeshift. Balaji Srivasan, I'm not sure how to say his last name, but he's the former CTO of Coinbase, and he's the creator of this concept called the network state. He's got a book on it, and that's sort of how you can create a country, a decentralized country on the internet. Fascinating theory. And then also Jack Dorsey, which is not one you would really think of, but he was the former CEO of Twitter. And if you kind of look at him during that time, he almost seemed like he was being held hostage by his own company. He's talked publicly a lot about how he regrets the direction Twitter has gone, and how Twitter should have been a protocol, not a company. He has put a tremendous amount of funding into Nostr, and as well as other freedom tech. $1 million to Graphene, Calyx, Signal, and I believe $21 million donated to the decentralized Nostr project. He's also tweeted that we should disband the CIA and support for Rothbard and all sorts of stuff. So Dorsey's an interesting character. Here's a few books that you guys could check out, some resources for Crypto-Anarchy. I'm actually working on getting the Genesis book for all of our Patreon subscribers. We're going to get signed copies of those. So if you're a Patreon subscriber, you'll get a signed copy of the Genesis book in a month or two. So these are some cool books. The Genesis book is sort of about the ideas that led to the creation of Bitcoin. It's one of the best books I've ever read. Highly recommend it. But if you're a Patreon member, we'll get you a signed copy. All right, so that leads us to takeaways. In the spirit of cypherpunks, utilize and build tools for liberty. Write code. If you can't write code, then write about code and utilize code. Embrace privacy, invest in Bitcoin Monero, and actually use them. Don't just hold them. Opt out of all mainstream systems and stop using companies that abuse you and companies that hate you. Always try to use open source over closed source, control your data, self-host it when you can, and also encrypt your data when you can. If you would like some ideas for things that you could use, this is a little project that I'm working on. So that's our logo there, libertytools.io. Just going to show you real quick. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I know I've been going for a minute. So this is just a little project that I've been working on. It's sort of a competitor to Privacy Tools, if you guys are familiar with it. It's libertytools.io. It is a list of every single tool that I could find to advance human freedom. You see on the left here, agorism, which is a concept that we didn't talk on, but similar to crypto-anarchy. It's how to opt outside the state. COVID, defense, education, all these other things. OSINT, got a massive OSINT list there, open source intelligence. And then we're gonna keep adding more to the site. It's just a little side project. It's my very small contribution to crypto-anarchy that I'm trying to make. So in that end, I'm done. And as Timothy C. May said, arise, you have nothing to lose but your barbed wire fences. So thank you, and we can do a few questions.
Wonderful. Give it up for Josh, everybody. What a great talk, great talk. So please raise your hand for questions, and I'll bring the microphone to you. Please speak into the microphone. So we'll start up here and work our way around.
Artem's always got the tough questions.
I hope. So you didn't say anything regarding obfuscation. So I hope obfuscation. So idea how you can send signal and hide the fact of you send signal. So do you understand this approach?
I didn't catch all that. Obfuscation and send signal?
Yeah, you send something and nobody actually understands that you was sending something. Have you heard about this idea? Do you know about this?
I'm not entirely sure I'm following what you're saying.
Obfuscating sending a message in the first place.
Okay. So like encrypting?
No.
It's different?
Yes, it's different. So
steganography? Is that what you're talking about?
Kind of.
Okay. That's where you would hide something in a picture.
Yes.
Okay.
There are several methods, but it's so it should be kind of
Sure.
okay. So why you didn't say about this? Because it's kind of very important for protect people regarding like these people.
Sure. Was the talk not long enough for you? Did you want to? So there was a. Sure. This was mostly a historical talk. I want to talk more about the ideas rather than like direct practical things. So I did more of that when I did my privacy talk a year and a half ago. And there's a lot more I wanted to talk about. I had to cut it down. But if you go to my website, libertytools.io, there's a lot of cool things that you can use there, and there might be an answer to your question. I mean, there's a lot of good encrypted apps that you could use for sending messages, but a lot of the time the problem with these is the network effect, getting other people to use them as well. So like SimpleX is a really cool encrypted messaging app, but not a lot of people use it right now. So that's why like the Liberty on the Rocks group is Telegram, which isn't the best for privacy, but it's a nice simple app that a lot of people use, and that's why we're on there, and it's better than text messages. So I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but.
So this is more of a comment, but I actually have a personal history with e-gold. My father was big into it back in the day, and eventually the Secret Service came after him about the moneylender's licenses. They gave him an ultimatum, effectively said, give up all of your e-gold, get a moneylender's license, or we arrest you. And my father ultimately gave up his e-gold, unfortunately, and that was kind of a major L. We got back into, like Bitcoin and real cryptocurrency now, but I just wanted to point that out.
I'm sure there were many such cases, unfortunately, and it really showed the need for why currency needs to be decentralized. They won't let you have a centralized currency that competes with the US dollar. They won't allow it. So.
Yeah, I just want to mention the term the gentleman is looking for is steganography. There are tools to hide data in safe-looking messages. And so if you Google steganography, you'll see there's a variety of tools that lets you hide a message within other data.
Yeah, usually pictures, you can hide it, incorporate it in there. But yeah, it's a well-known thing in the cyberspace industry.
I was surprised to hear that part of the story started out with at MIT, one of the elite universities within our country, which we think of now as being like universally compliant with government restrictions and everything. And do you think that's more of a culture thing or just a rogue or?
I think it was different back then. 40 years ago, that's where real learning was done. That's where cutting edge was done. There's places like Bell Labs in the 50s, but other than that, it was pretty much all colleges. It was Berkeley, MIT, all these guys came out of there. They were all mathematicians, but there was no real competition back then. Now, you can learn all this on the internet. There's 100 different free courses you can download. You can get all these different books. You can do online schools. Just back then, that was a real source of knowledge, was college, and that's where you went if you were a math genius. Where else are you going to go prior to the internet? Well, you can do that now. Yeah. You can learn anything you want to learn just about on the internet for a relatively cheap price. So.
Since the talk was about the use of technology for the liberty movement, I mean, that's how you started off. Yep. I'm offended you didn't bring up AI. No, just kidding.
Would you say AI?
Yeah. No,
I actually...
No, but here's my
briefly
question. I do have a question. My question is, because, of course, the talk went over an hour, and like you're saying, you had a lot of topics to discuss. What are your thoughts about, like, what sort of impact AI is going to have on the liberty movement or vice versa, especially considering that the companies that are leading AI development are kind of these establishment companies like Microsoft, Google, and OpenAI, which is co-opted by Microsoft. So, yeah, what are your thoughts about, is AI going to be a good thing for liberty or not?
Well, the short answer is things are going to get real weird over the next 10, 20 years. Things are going to continually get weird. I think it's a mixed bag. It's going to be a tough problem to solve because like digital content creation is just going to get out of control. But that shows sort of the weirdness of intellectual property and how that works, right? And most good libertarians don't believe in intellectual property, and AI is just showing what insane concept it actually is. We're taking it to peak ad absurdum, essentially. There's a really good podcast that you might like, AI Unchained, with Guy Swan. He's a Bitcoin libertarian guy, and he basically goes through all of these topics and talks about sort of the freedom aspects of different AI tools. Now, if you go to my website, libertytools.io/OSINT, I've got a bunch of AI tools here and some brief descriptions. A few that I found pretty interesting, specifically from like a liberty perspective. So there's Venice, which I mentioned earlier. That's Eric Voorhees' project. Doesn't spy on you, doesn't collect your data, doesn't censor you. So there's no built-in, wokeness, like, you can't ask that question because it might come out with a bad answer. So Venice AI is a cool project, and that's going to be utilizing crypto specifically. Ironically, not Bitcoin or Monero. I was a little disappointed in that, but it's all Web3 Ethereum stuff. But also you can see some other interesting projects here. GAT-GPT, that's Cody Wilson's project. It's an LLM to help you guide you through the 3D process of creating weapons. So I think things like that are really cool. Alex AI, which is Alex Epstein, answers your questions on energy and climate change. Gab AI, which is kind of like a right-wing alternative. So there's a bunch of things here. libertytools.io/OSINT. I'm going to keep adding them as I find them. And I think it's going to be weird, but a lot of it is good. Guy Swan also has another podcast called Coding for Non-Devs, which is specifically about how you can like 10x your skills with these AI tools, especially if you're something like a systems administrator. You can write code without knowing how to write code. So Guy is talking about this. He's like, I've wrote dozens of apps now, and I have no idea how to code. So that's kind of a cool thing that I think AI will allow for.
So I really like the narrative arc that you brought all the way to the end of effectively today. And I'm really hoping that we can continue the conversation as new technologies come about. That's what I'm most excited about and working towards, is things like zero-knowledge proofs that Zcash pioneered are now becoming more generic and approachable, not just for cryptographers, for regular old engineers. So I guess a question is, would there be people interested in continuing actually tinkering with these tools that are now accessible to non-math geniuses?
Is that a question for me or the room?
Maybe the room, you too.
I don't know. Raise your hand if you would be interested. A few hands. But yeah, Zuko Wilcox lives in Boulder. I need to get him to come speak here at some point. Zcash and some of those other ones, the privacy's less good, and someone like Zuko, while he was a cypherpunk, has kind of talked about like, well, private, but not too private. We got to let the feds go after people. This is actually something that Phil Zimmerman said. So in 2022, I was at Monerotopia right before I went to Guns and Bitcoin, and they brought Phil Zimmerman in on camera. And so the host, Doug, asked him, he's like, well, what are your thoughts on Monero? You know, you're the guy who created PGP. What do you think? He's like, I don't really like Monero. We need to be able to track anyone giving money to the Russians. You know, Ukraine, we have to support Ukraine. We can't let the Russians get money. And Monero's just, it's too private, and I don't really like it. And he's saying this as he's speaking at Monerotopia. So, you know, never meet your heroes. It was a sad day for me.
Josh, what a great speech. Thanks a lot, man. And I wanted to say thank you for bringing up Roger Ver, because it was here at the Denver Bitcoin Center back when we were in, what was it, Southern Hospitality Restaurant?
Yep,
that we brought Roger Ver Denver appearance here, and it's good to hear you talk about that. I know that I was a big part of that, and we were a big part of that. But what do you think we can do to help? You know, we already talked about, you know, some of the political people that are under attack from the tyranny. What do you think we can do to help support getting them free using cryptocurrency?
So, I mean, the number one thing is probably just to continue to talk about it. In Roger's case, it's not like he needs the money. You know, he can fund his own defense. I have it somewhere in here. I forget exactly where it is. There is a foundation to support Samurai Wallet, and I don't know if any of it goes to Tornado Cash. If you want to learn more about those two, check out freedom.tech. Seth for Privacy writes about this a lot. One second here, maybe I can find it. There's a Bitcoin wallet project that is specifically trying to focus on open source tech. Actually, I know where it is. There's actually a few different organizations that are trying to do this. So here on this section, I have Liberty Organizations. So you go to legal advocacy, scroll down a little bit, and then these bottom ones are Coin Center, the crypto lawyers, the Peer-to-Peer Rights Fund, and Stand With Crypto. So specifically the Peer-to-Peer Rights Fund, they are working to defend Samurai. So in the case of Roger, I don't really know. You can just talk about it. You know, if you're on Twitter, tweet for liberty. You can do that kind of stuff. You can get on Nostr. Try and get more of the Bitcoin community in, because a lot of the Bitcoin community doesn't like Roger anymore. You know? Huh? Because of the block size wars, they didn't like the way he conducted himself. He was on the side that lost. It was the small blockers versus the big blockers. And he was very adamant on the small blocker side. That side lost. Most modern Bitcoiners, or I'm sorry, he was on the big blocker side. Most modern Bitcoiners are on the small block side.
I got a question for you, Josh. During all your research and study, was there anybody that you really felt connected to? Any of these people that you talked about tonight? Anybody maybe that was a real inspiration, or somebody that kind of stands out of the others?
I mean, I've always really admired Cody, which is kind of ironic because I'm not like that into 3D guns. But Cody is one of the most eloquent people you'll ever see. He's brilliant, almost too much sometimes. He gets really esoteric and philosophical, like overly, a lot of the time. But his work is really interesting and pretty inspiring, which is kind of a shame. He's on the outs a little bit with the 3D gun community. It's a whole thing with DefCAD charges, even though they're actually legally required to charge. That was part of one of the lawsuits, is they're legally required to charge. And they were actually, at one point, they weren't allowed to send downloads out, so they were physically snail mailing people flash drives with 3D CAD files. But I find him really interesting. That's why he was, kind of a big part of the presentation. Kind of going through all of this, I didn't realize how big a contributor Adam Back was. So I thought that was kind of an interesting one. He's not someone I followed a whole lot. He's the CEO of a company called Blockstream, which is a Bitcoin company. But a lot of his early contributions were pretty interesting. So I like those.
Hey, Josh. Great talk. Thank you for educating us on the great history and the narrative and all that. I just have a simple question. Why didn't you include John McAfee in your list of death athletes?
So that was kind of a tough thing, actually, right? Is who to include in that. One is time. There's a lot more I wanted to talk more about, like agorism, but I felt that it didn't quite fit. So John McAfee he's kind of a shyster in a lot of ways. Like, he did a lot of good things too, but he was a bullshit artist. Like, let's be honest.
He was the LP candidate.
Yeah, we've seen how that goes. Now, so I did mention him, that he was in the same prison as Roger Ver, and he died there, and that's unfortunate. But there's another person I wanted to mention too, was Dexter Taylor. I don't know if you guys have followed this. So Dexter Taylor is a software engineer in New York who just got convicted of 10 years for 3D printing a gun. That's it. He just printed the gun. He didn't sell it. He didn't share files online. He just printed it.
It's New York.
I mean, yeah, literally, it's New York. So the reason I didn't mention him is that while that's a horrible story and he's a victim, it wasn't a death athlete in the same way. He wasn't doing this for a greater cause. He just was a hobbyist who thought it was fun. And I don't see McAfee as that way. McAfee was just kind of a crazy person who did a lot of good stuff, but also just kind of got caught up. So I mean, and I don't know enough about McAfee. He probably did more good than I actually know of. But from what I saw, he was a bullshitter. So
Thank you.
Any final questions? All right, everybody. Well, that's our talk. Give it up for Josh.
thank you guys. I love you all. Thanks for coming.